This is going to be another quite theoretical paper, I'm afraid, although hopefully with some not too unimportant empirical consequences to close the talk. On the essentially dynamic nature of concepts, I leave it as an open question to you whether the much belongs in the subtitle or not. I didn't originally have it in the subtitle. I added it because I thought it sounded a bit sexier and also more provocative. So this paper is about the question of whether our concepts change. If our concepts do change, then which concepts change and how? Whether they change as a matter of contingent requirement or of necessity. Whether this applies to some of our concepts or all of our concepts. Indeed, whether our concepts are in a state of continuous motion, which is actually the point I'm going to try to convince you of before the end of this talk. But let's start with the question of just how stable our concepts really are. Now, when we are giving properties of concepts, we talk about their systematicity, the way they can be applied systematically and across unboundedly many contexts. We talk about their productivity, the way we can take a finite number of them and combine them and recombine them in unboundedly many ways to make unboundedly many complex concepts, and at least in the case of linguistically capable agents, also propositions. We talk about their compositionality, their intentionality, and so on. We don't usually explicitly address their stability. Nevertheless, people do seem to assume that our concepts are, at least most of the time, mostly stable. That is, I think most people would allow that our concepts may change, but normally they would say that our concepts are more or less fixed. It might even seem that this must be the case in order for the systematicity and the productivity and the compositionality of conceptually structured thought to go through. There are even accounts, and Jerry Fodor's informational atomism is only one of a number of them, according to which our concepts cannot change. On informational atomism's account, they cannot change because what makes a concept of, say, dog, a concept of dogs, is all and only that that concept tracks dogs and nothing else, dogs in the real world. Now, of course, an approach such as this, where a concept's contents are strictly defined by its extension, assumes a certain realist metaphysics that one might or might not agree with. For many, if not most, if not all of the people in this room, it avoids what we might think is the interesting story, which is what happens between the concept and the world, what happens in the interaction of our conceptual frameworks with the world. Phrasing this a different way, pretty much everybody agrees that concepts are constitutive of beliefs. Jerry Fodor agrees with that, no problem. The question is whether our beliefs are in turn partly constitutive of our concepts. And here Fodor, of course, would say not. Prototype theorists would generally, if not without exception, even say yes, our beliefs are partly constitutive of our concepts. They help to shape our concepts. But you might say that even if you allow that beliefs are partly constitutive of our concepts, nevertheless, beliefs can change, but they don't need to change. There are beliefs that never change. So The same thing with concepts, right? I'm going to argue, no, not right. What I take to be relatively uncontroversial is that concepts, for at least the people in this room, probably for anyone who is a prototype theorist, is that concepts, to function as concepts, must be open to change. They cannot deny the possibility of change. And indeed, a concept that completely ceases to be open to change is, on such an account, a dead concept. It does not function as a concept. Likewise, at least relatively uncontroversial, is the idea that our concepts have a life cycle of birth, maturation, and at least in many cases death, where we find oftentimes that the death of one concept is the formation of another or another set of concepts. That is to say, we can think of the process as the death of one concept and the birth of another, or we can see an underlying continuity with a somewhat radical break between the former state of the concept and the new state of the concept. So we can think of this in terms of discontinuities or in terms of continuities. All of this I take to be relatively uncontroversial. But what about a concept, you might ask, that as a matter of contingent necessity never happens to change? And that, I'm going to try to convince you, doesn't happen either. Now, there is a basic tension, I think, in the nature of concepts, in the nature of conceptual agency, of conceptual frameworks. And that tension is the following. On the one hand, our concepts, in order to function as concepts, must be stable enough to apply across unboundedly many contexts. That's the systematicity of conceptually structured thought. But, on the other hand, and at the same time, and compositionality would seem to require this. Compositionality, systematicity, and productivity would all seem to require this relative stability. But at the same time, these concepts, all of our concepts, seemingly apply always back to specific contexts. And each context is, you might think inevitably, somehow and substantively different from any context that has gone before. So every time we apply our concepts, we have to squeeze and reshape them a little bit in order to fit. The implication is that there is always going to be some amount, however small, of adjustment or adaptation each time we apply our concepts. And as conceptual agents, we are applying our conceptual agency nearly constantly through our waking lives. So, relatively uncontroversial, again, is the idea that concepts must be stable enough to function as concepts in order to be systematic and productive, but they can't afford to be too stable, because if they become too stable, they die. But, of course, I want to argue here for something much stronger, as applied by the title of the paper, and that is the idea, the potentially radical idea, that concepts to function as concepts must be in a state of constant, if incremental, motion. Each application of a concept perturbs that concept at least slightly. And not only that concept, but all of our other concepts as well, because our concepts exist within a complex, context-sensitive, interdependent web of contextual dependencies. Jerry Fodor is famous for having suggested that it is entirely conceivable, says Fodor, that we could have a language, a natural language, whose only word was John. He acknowledges that it would not be a very interesting language, but he thinks it is perfectly possible and coherent. He thinks that intuitions require the possibility of such a language. His implication is that you could have only one concept and still be a conceptual agent. I would take as given, and perhaps I'm wrong here, but I think for all of the people in this room, we are rather going to assume that concepts do not exist in isolation from each other, that, in fact, there is a complex, interwoven web of dependencies among our concepts. And so if you do pull on any thread in the web of these concepts, you are going to send ripples out through the entire network. That should be true at every level at which it is appropriate to talk about conceptual agency. I have said before, earlier in the week, I have written in a number of publications the idea that conceptual spaces should apply at multiple levels. We can talk about conceptual spaces for the individual, for the group, such as the research group of conceptual spaces theorists, for the linguistic community that forms a society. We can even talk about some set of concepts for the entire species. Of course, the change that takes place in our concepts is going to be on different time scales at each of these levels. It's going to presumably be the fastest at the level of individual agents and the slowest at the level of the species. Nevertheless, there is going to be some amount of motion. That's the argument. And to give some indication of how radical this position possibly is, even the most seemingly fixed of our concepts, say mathematical concepts of things like prime numbers or evenness or oddness, may be seen to evolve, to change over time. For the individual, again, more than for the linguistic community or for the species. But number theory is not something that has stood still over time. Number theory continues to change and evolve. And as number theory evolves, so do all of the concepts that apply to number theory. Failure to be aware of change should not at any point be taken as evidence of a lack of change. And I think all too often that's precisely what happens. So I'm suggesting that there is a kind of inverse illusion going on here to what we see with this famous illusion. It doesn't work with a projector very well, but it does work very well on my computer screen. If I look at my computer screen right now, it looks like the wheels are rotating. Because of the flicker of the projector, I don't think it actually works for you in the audience.
It does.
Oh, it does. Excellent. So I want to suggest that what concepts are doing is a kind of inverse illusion. They're giving the illusion of being motionless when they're actually in motion. So here is something that isn't moving, and we can tell when we look closely. Concepts, I'm suggesting, if we look closely, we will see that they are moving. So a few examples by way of analogy. Consider watching time-lapse photography of a supposedly motionless plant. If you do this, you will discover that very many plants move in very complex, very interesting, very animal-like fashions, just on a much slower time scale to animals. So the idea that plants don't move in intention-like ways even, is actually an illusion. Or consider drawing a figure on a succession of pieces of paper and then riffling through that stack of papers very, very quickly. This is a very easy way, very traditional way of making an animation. If the figure is in different locations on the various sheets of paper, you will have the illusion of a moving figure. But if you draw the figure in the same location on each piece of paper, then you will still have the appearance of a stable figure. You'll have the appearance of a stable figure standing still, even though there still is really no stable figure. Or, again, another example. Consider looking out the window of a fast-moving train. And I loved to do this myself when I was a child, because you don't see a blur of vegetation rushing past you, at least if the vegetation is close enough. You see no apparent motion. Rather, what you see is a seemingly stable, if quite random, image of blurred colors in long, stringy threads. Now, of course, the vegetation is moving. You know the vegetation is moving. Actually, you're moving relative to the vegetation. But it gives the appearance of a stable, unchanging image. And my final example is my favorite, actually, which is the first time as a child, each and every one of us looked at a sample of pond water in a microscope, and that seemingly inert pond water was full of moving organisms that were moving very, very rapidly, a whole bunch of them. And most, if not all of us, had a sense of surprise because the water looked like it was just sitting there, empty, motionless. So you might think that there is very good reason to believe that the world that we live in is a world of motion, intrinsically and inevitably, a world of continuous motion. Concepts, of course, are meant to reflect the world as accurately as possible. That's true regardless of whether you are a metaphysical realist or an anti-realist. I happen to be an anti-realist. You still expect the concepts to reflect the mind-independent world as accurately as possible. You expect the mind-independent world, even on a Kantian account, to fundamentally constrain the concepts that we can form about it. Concepts are the means by which we structure all of our understandings about the world around us. They are the primary means by which we approach the world. We cannot set our conceptual frameworks aside in order to view the world in a way that does not reflect the coloring effects of our conceptual frameworks. So this is implying, I am a metaphysical anti-realist. I believe that our concepts and our world are inextricably intertwined with each other, that our subjective experience and our objective reality do not cleanly pull apart from each other. But you don't need to take an anti-realist position, as I say, to allow that concepts should reflect the mind-independent world. It's just the way that they do it is going to be different. So concepts are the means by which we approach the world. At the same time, perhaps they distort and simplify that world in the pursuit of making it understandable for us. So you might think that the world itself is too complex, too overwhelming, too multidimensional in order for our senses, in order for our minds to make any sense of. And as a quote that I love to use from Peter's 2000 book says, what our conceptual agency does is a massive amount of dimensional reduction in order to come up with nice, neat simplifications that we can actually use to interact with the world. Now, consider that our concepts impose boundaries onto underlying continuities. If this is a good way of looking at our conceptual agency, then there is no need, I think, to appeal to natural kinds concepts. And I suspect that many of you in the room who are familiar with the discussion on natural kinds concepts would agree with me here, that even if it is the case that nature has joints along which it might be carved, nevertheless, our concepts do not necessarily reflect those joints in any way. Rather, our concepts are imposing boundaries that we find to be useful in the applications that we have for our concepts. The well-known psychological phenomenon of categorical perception might very reasonably be extended to all of our concepts. This is an idea that I take both from Peter Jerdenfors and also from Stefan Harnad, both of whom have raised this suggestion. So, as we all know, if you hear a continuous succession of tones varying an exact amount each time, subjects will hear an abrupt break between one tone range and another tone range, even though the variation is continuous. And you can see this in different sensory modalities. And as I say, the suggestion from Peter, from Stefan Harnad, is that we might reasonably apply this to all of our concepts. So just as our concepts impose boundaries onto underlying continuities, so too I want to suggest do they impose a degree of stability onto a constantly shifting world, reifying processes into objects in the process, fixing them into place, giving them a more concrete appearance. Ironically, given that our concepts are by their nature intrinsically abstract things. Taking snapshots as they go, snapshots of the world that need constantly to be touched up so that they continue to be relevant, so they continue to be applicable. This raises the question, how much is our view of a relatively stable world nothing more than a conceptual imposition? So just as I want to suggest our world is in constant motion, and our concepts ought to reflect that motion, so too our conceptual spaces are in motion, and our theories about our concepts are and should be recognized as being in motion. So just as concepts are imposing stability and imposing clear boundaries onto the world, they're doing the same things to themselves. And there is an important distinction that we can make here between concepts as and when we reflect on them, and concepts when we simply get on with possessing and employing them non-reflectively. When we stop and reflect on them, they become reifications. The processes get fixed down into objects. But when we're simply possessing and employing them non-reflectively, they might better be understood as non-representational processes. So they are one thing when we stop and look at them directly. They are logically something quite different when we are simply using them pre-reflectively or non-reflectively. Now, the more abstract or the more higher order that our concepts are, then yes, the more relatively stable they will be, but still with the caveat that they must be open to change, and not just open to change, they must be incrementally perturbed by any changes within the wider conceptual framework. The less abstract, the lower order, the more physical, the more concrete our concepts are, the closer they are to the world, then the more dynamic they should be to reflect the inherent dynamics of the world around us. A theory of concepts, whether it be conceptual spaces theory or proxy types theory, or any of the other theories of concepts that we've talked about this week, is necessarily a highly abstract, higher order conceptual entity. As such, it's going to be relatively more stable. It still needs to be open, however, to change. So, Good. That's about the right amount of time. So, consequences, theoretical and practical, of assuming that, for sake of argument, that our concepts are in a state of constant, of incremental motion. Theoretical implications first. Theorists of concepts or theorists of knowledge representation or conceptual spaces researchers, such as ourselves, need to take account of time in, I think, a much more active way than we typically do at the moment. We need to build a time dimension into the models that we're building. We need to build models that move. We need to be thinking less about mind maps, which is ironic because I like to talk about mind maps with conceptual spaces all the time, but we need to be thinking less in terms of mind maps and more something like TomTom. Do people know what TomToms are? They are interactive, speaking navigation guides. What are the other alternatives? I forget. Anyway, that's what a TomTom is. It doesn't just show you a map, it directs you through the map to your destination. So theories of concepts or theories of knowledge representation or theories of conceptual spaces likewise need to be open not just to the possibility of change, but they need to be seen as and they need to be evolving entities. These theories cannot stay still if they are to remain relevant, if they are to remain useful. That includes conceptual spaces theory. This is difficult because often, especially with grant applications, there's a great deal of pressure to focus on the goal, on finding the one right, final, correct answer. But as I have argued elsewhere, there is no particular reason to think that there is one final, correct answer for most phenomena of any sufficient complexity. There may be multiple correct explanations that we are unable to reconcile with each other, merely because of our cognitive limitations. And finally, what are some practical implications of this view on conceptual change? Well, we should do AI, and we should build AI systems in a different way, perhaps a radically different way. I should note that conceptual spaces is already part of a broader movement toward rejecting two things. Rejecting both the GoFi approach, the overly symbolic, physical symbol system-like approaches, where everything is expressed in explicit symbols on the one hand, and on the other, the connectionist approaches, the overly associationist approaches that are based on pure artificial neural networks and the like. So just as on conceptual spaces accounts, concepts sit in the middle between symbols and associations, beholden to neither knowing how nor knowing that. Likewise, a theory of concepts should be couched in terms that are neither overly symbolic nor overly associationist. And I note as well that this echoes very much comments that have been coming for years from the inactivist community. I've talked with Peter about the close associations between conceptual spaces theory and inactivism. And I think he's in general agreement with that. We should also finally build robots in a different way, less with fully fledged conceptual spaces built in, perhaps, although there is still a place for doing that. But these fully fledged conceptual spaces are going to be more like toy worlds and perhaps not a whole lot to tell us about the actual world. When we are using conceptual spaces with robots, and I'd love to be doing this again, I haven't been working with robots at all since my study days as a doctoral student, but we should be, I think, giving our robots more minimally partitioned conceptual spaces. Minimally partitioned conceptual spaces that the robot then is able to go out and develop in interaction with its environment using its various sensory apparati. Arguably, one of the problems with many GoFi systems It's just how much gets built into them. If you build too much in, then there can't really be any flexibility of interaction with the environment. You close off the possibility to truly flexible response and learning. This I take to be the really take-home message that I want to take from John Searle's Chinese room thought experiment. Basically, everything that the robot does should perturb its developing conceptual spaces in a way that leaves all of the concepts in its conceptual framework in continuous, if incremental, motion. A quick parting thought that I take from Douglas Hofstadter's Gödel Bach, a koan that he offers from the Zen Buddhist tradition. Two monks were arguing about a flag. One said, "The flag is moving." The other said, "The wind is moving." The sixth patriarch, Zeno, happened to be passing by. He told them, "Not the wind, not the flag. Mind is moving." Thank you very much.
Technology for Q&A? Do we need technology for the Q&A?
Okay, good.
I guess if you're trying to might be to some extent an empirical question, but I guess most of us would agree that it's pretty easy to find examples of concepts that move around over time, like what's a fast car today compared to what was a fast car 50 years ago, etc. But does anyone really believe that the first alternative view you sketched, this idea about concepts are constant?
There are some people who seriously try to defend.
Crazy philosophers. You can always find philosophers, but seriously.
If you are committed even implicitly to a strongly realist metaphysics, then I think you're going to be inclined towards something like that view. That would be my guess.
If you're playing, you have this ideal fast car in mind, the 2000, yeah. But come on, seriously.
I would say that in practice, most of us are not good metaphysical realists.
Okay, so thanks for the talk. So just two suggestions about how to model the dynamics, or how it's already present. So there was already one suggestion in Peter's 2000 book. So when you're not a prototype theorist, but you believe in exemplars, you remember how when you go to you see a new exemplar, then you calculate a new gravity mass, and you have a new formula decimation. So that's one.
So every new example should perturb the prototype at least slightly. Yes.
Yeah. And then there is something. It's like there is a kind of vibration built into the model. I mean, think of this also. So you start with a similarity space, which is built on multi-dimensional scale, and that's it, right? Then you endow it with concepts. And now there is a strange phenomenon which you refer to of categorical perception.
Yeah.
Now, strangely enough, this changes the similarity judgments.
Yeah.
Or the confusion probabilities, whatever you use to build on. So it means that, so now you have the concepts, but now you get a slightly different similarity space. Because the similarity space is built on the similarity judgments or the confusion probabilities. Again, you have your...
Well, the similarity judgments change the broader our experience becomes. And so when we cross over one of these thresholds, then we draw a boundary, then we get a new set of metrics and a new similarity judgments.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. And so it continues in a sense. As I said, I mean, there's always, it's constantly a little bit shifting already for that reason. It's built into the model that it's not fixed, the concepts are not fixed.
Yeah. So I'm just trying to make this a little bit more explicit.
Yeah. Although I'm not disagreeing,
Yeah.
I'm just suggesting how it may already be there.
And if all of our concepts are indeed tied into a very complex interwoven web, then changing any one of them is going to send ripples out through the whole system.
Yeah.
I mean, I follow up on Igor's point here. You talk mainly about new input, and Igor mentioned new examples we see or something. But one thing I was missing in your practical application was the role of interaction. I mean, when we communicate, and one of the major sources for moving concepts is that we start talking with people and realize that I don't mean the same thing with the word as we do. And in order to have some kind of meeting of minds, as I call it, you need to have an adjustment. Otherwise, you just talk past one another. And so you find that. I mean, I think this is underestimated, the role of how we change the meaning of the words, even in a fairly short conversation.
Yeah.
And I would really like more research on that. I mean, there are people like Pickering and Gallagher and so on who do some work on it, but we need more work on how we adjust meanings during an ordinary conversation.
No, I agree fully with that. The reason I left that out is precisely because I want to pull concepts apart from language, and I want to be able to talk about conceptual agency in a range of species that do not have human-style language. Definitely, though, language transforms and extends our conceptual abilities. It makes possible more abstract concepts than were possible before. And also, I think it allows us to take the same concepts and think about them at more and more abstract levels.
Okay, I have a question. So thanks for the talk. I was trying to apply it while you were speaking to the example of color space. That's what I had in mind. But then I wasn't sure with the example you gave of the more abstract. You said those will be more stable, and the more concrete, the less abstract will be more dynamic. And I was thinking that, I don't know if you will agree, I thought color space doesn't strike me as very abstract, it's directly perceivable, but I think it is quite stable. Maybe not in children, but in most adults, I suspect it will be quite stable. And then the examples you gave from the abstract number theory, for instance, it is very easy to change that. Like if I read a new book and there's another definition, I just adapt to it. So maybe it will actually turn out to be the other way around.
With our color space, I think not only is that already quite abstract, more than we necessarily realize, but also that we can think of the color space at different levels of abstraction. So in its most concrete form, we think of it in terms of our interactions with the objects and the lighting of the world around us, particular occasions of color experience. At increasingly abstract levels, we think about things like the color cone, we think about aesthetic judgments of color, which are yet more abstract, and so on. So our color concepts really can be understood at multiple levels of abstraction. But because they are, at least as I want to frame them, in the realm of properties, I take properties to be of their nature relatively more abstract than objects or actions. So although, yes, you can think of more concrete applications and less concrete or more abstract applications of colors, nevertheless, they are generally much more abstract than even our abstract objects or abstract actions that we think of. Now, what was the other example with numbers?
I gave an example of number theory. I would think if I'm reading a new book on mathematics and there will be a new definition for, I don't know which concept, I will easily adapt to that, and more easily than when we would argue about which is red. I'm quite sure I will not change my mind on that. Whereas if you have a new theory, I will adapt immediately.
I question whether you adapt immediately and wholeheartedly, or if there is not, again, a process of gradual adjustment from the old way of thinking to the new way of thinking. But regardless, on every application of our mathematical skills, again, every time we use numbers, every time we use mathematical concepts like primeness or evenness or oddness, every new application, I think, perturbs our understanding of those concepts at least slightly. And the underlying number theory itself, as I said in the talk, is evolving over time. We don't think about numbers the way that we used to. We didn't even have 0 until not so terribly long ago. That was a major change.
Okay, we have to keep it moving.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your excellent talk. And I think regarding the discussion, so Fodor is very serious about certain claims.
Oh, yes.
And also so that he seems to be the most cited cognitive scientist in the world, so it's not, regardless of being, it's not irrelevant, even though it's for most of us, it sounds somehow kind of not very reasonable. But I just want to share you kind of agreeing very much and thanking you for a very clear presentation about, so I really enjoyed very much your presentation, and just sharing kind of experience on a kind of discussion club that we were active in with Mauri actually 20 years ago at University of Helsinki on cognitive science and related fields. And there, as a very young kind of understanding related to concepts, but kind of the kind of agreement, as a sign of the agreement, the metaphor of a concept, there was a question that what are concepts? And then my metaphor was that concepts are like trees or birches in wind. It's not kind of satisfactory, but at least it was kind of in the same spirit as the talk.
As I say, my favorite metaphor there is the microscope, where we think that the thing we're looking at, the sample of pond water, is completely static, and we find that it's just teeming with movement. But yes, that's also a good example.
Hi, I wondered whether your theory of dynamicness in concepts had any insight into insight. So when you do suddenly get this sort of flash and completely change your view or something.
Yeah, I think that when we talk about concepts, we need to be talking about consciousness more or less simultaneously. I consider them to be like two sides of a single coin. So more or less, those occasions where we attribute conceptual agency, those are the ones where we attribute some degree of consciousness, and vice versa. Where we attribute some degree of consciousness, we're also attributing some degree of some type of conceptual agency. And I think we need to think of consciousness as existing not as an on-off state, not as a binary condition, but as a whole progression of different states from the fully unconscious through the subconscious, the pre-reflectively conscious, the fully reflectively conscious, and so on. In which case, what happens with insight is that changes that are burbling up from below in our pre-reflective conscious awareness suddenly cross over the threshold and become introspectively available to us, I think.
It was very, very small?
It's very small.
Okay.
In the same club, it's called iClub, Timo mentioned, we often discuss the enactive theory. And you mentioned it very briefly. What do you think is the contribution of this theory?
The core idea for me is that our notions of inner experience and outer reality reflect a very misleading application of terms, and that words and concepts like inner and outer, internal and external apply to physical volumes, and that when we're talking about mind, about cognition, about conceptual agency and consciousness, that these things are not physical volumes. They're physically instantiated, but they're not themselves physically. They're not themselves physical volumes. So the core idea to me is the notion of a continuity between agent and environment, where we draw arbitrary boundaries, where the agent stops and the world begins. And we can shift that, and we do shift that back and forth over time.